Nasdaq is doing fine. Gold and silver are ballooning, and then you have Bitcoin basically falling off a cliff.
Right.
In your opinion, what has happened that there is such a big disconnect between the assets?
Yeah, I really do think it's similar to 2019 in terms of like Bitcoin. So it feels different in a sense, right? Like this cycle feels different in a
Yeah.
sense of there hasn't really been an alt season, right? There hasn't really been a period of gross speculation in higher risk assets. Um, but in other ways, it's been exactly the same in terms of like the length of the cycle, like the length of this cycle as measured from the low in late 2022 to measure the high in early October. It's basically in between the length of the last two cycles. So it's hard to look at that and be like and be too disappointed because it literally did what it always does with diminishing returns, right? I mean, Bitcoin still went up 8x from the bottom or something like that. I mean, it's still an insane return
Mm-hmm.
by most standards. Uh, I think the reason why it feels so different is because if you weren't invested in Bitcoin, if you're more so invested in a lot of altcoins, you really weren't able to capture those same types of gains unless you were able to take shorter term trades, right? Like if you bought an altcoin and then you sold it a month or two later, and then you knew which ones to buy, like it's possible you could have outperformed Bitcoin. But for a lot of people that just want to like put their money somewhere and then go live their life, right? Bitcoin was one of the better places to be, and it was also a lot lower risk than a lot of the other cryptocurrencies, in my opinion, because it's been around longer, it's got the higher market cap, sort of proven itself. I think the way that this cycle is different than the end of 2021 and the end of 2017 and the end of 2013 is that the high that occurred did not occur on euphoria, but it occurred on apathy, right? So a lot of time, like in 2021, what really kind of, and in 2017, what really led to those brutal bear markets, arguably, was all these retail investors coming in at the top, and then FOMO buying in at the top, and then kind of contributing to the sell pressure over the next year, right? Because they're called the weak hands, right? Like they buy the top, and then they sell off over the next year. It leads to the bear market, and then eventually they capitulate, they're gone, and then we start a new bull market. But this time, that's not really what happened. Like we didn't really have an influx of a lot of new retail investors. I track all the social metrics, and a lot of channels, Twitter accounts, wherever you want to look, like there hasn't really been that influx of new retail. And the only other time in history that I can find where Bitcoin found a top on apathy rather than euphoria was in 2019. And back then in 2019, Bitcoin topped in June. It topped 2 months before quantitative tightening ended, right? Bitcoin topped in June. And then July, August. QT officially ended in August. But if you go look at the chart, it's not obvious that it ended until September because you still had the last batch of Treasury securities that had to mature. And that didn't happen until further in August. So it doesn't look like the balance sheet started going up until September, even though QT ended in August 2019. So the only other time in history where Bitcoin topped on apathy rather than euphoria was in 2019, and it also occurred 2 months before QT ended, and it was also occurring during a time where the Fed was like begrudgingly lowering rates, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
they were lowering rates, but they weren't really I mean, even Powell came out a few weeks ago and said that the December rate cut, should not be a foregone conclusion. I mean, of course, they did end up cutting rates, but they're not advertising that hey, we're going to cut rates to zero. They're trying to keep people's expectations low. So I think that in a lot of ways, this cycle has been the same for Bitcoin, but in terms of euphoria, in terms of retail, it's actually been completely different. And that's why I think the current downturn in the price of Bitcoin more so resembles the 2019 downturn rather than the one we had in 2022, 2018, and 2014. It's just kind of like a nice coincidence once again that it happens to occur in Q4 of the post-halving year.
You were referencing to 2019, and I think that is interesting because 2019 was actually in the middle of the run to 2021 peak.
Right.
But you had what was the Chinese currency called back then? Oh no, it was
Well, the-
Libra, the Libra run. Um,
right.
and it ended at 14K, and then we went all the way back to 6,000 or whatever. And normally we would have had a new run after that until COVID happened. That basically was the big
Right.
crash on the market. So why do you compare the current period to 2019, or what similarities do you see?
Yeah, so in 2019, after that run that Bitcoin had, it was also a Bitcoin only rally in a sense. Not, I mean,
Hmm.
obviously other things rallied, but Bitcoin dominance rallied from like 35% in 2018 to 73% in 2019 during that rally. So that's one reason to compare it. Again, the comparison that I'm looking at is you're right, right? Like it eventually did lead into 2021, but that was after the money printers really came back on, and that was after rates went a lot lower. What I'm saying is there is a period in 2019 from June of 2019 until December of 2019, so 6 months, where the price of Bitcoin went down, right? It was a
Hmm.
6 month period. And so what I'm saying is that that part of the 2019 cycle, like that downward part, that's where we are right now. It just happens to line up to when a normal bear market for Bitcoin would occur, starting in Q4 of the post halving year. Um, so I think we're in a downturn right now. I do expect. I mean, like I feel like we're probably going to have some type of a counter trend rally sometime in early 2026. Normally, after a few months of a bear market, you will get at least a month or two here or there that's green. So I'm not like expecting down only. And I also don't expect down only because we didn't have a lot of retail FOMOing in at the top, right? The people that are selling now are mostly the people that maybe bought a year ago and the price hasn't moved and they're just getting tired and their
Hmm.
attention is leaving crypto and they're focusing on other stuff. And so they just sell it and they're like, go buy something else. So I think that we're sort of in that downturn where we've topped based on all these expectations of lower rates and QE. But now that that stuff is actually arriving, it's going to take longer than I think people expect for that, for the lower rates and for the money printing to start to really have an effect. Remember, in 2020 and 2021, the phase you referenced, that didn't really happen until they really turned the printers on and printed $6 trillion and also lowered rates to zero. So I'm not saying we can't get to that again. I'm just saying it's not like it would have been a mistake to assume it was going to happen in 2025 because by the way, when this all happened in 2019, as alt Bitcoin pairs went to 0.25 and Bitcoin dominance went to 70%, a lot of people would have assumed that, oh, alt Bitcoin pairs are at the range lows. That means we have to have an alt season. But really, back then, it took a year and a half to have an alt season after alt Bitcoin pairs hit the range lows, right? So there exists a scenario where we do get an alt season, but it's not until like next cycle, right? And maybe the downturn that we're currently in is just part of that 2019 style bear market. And if it is a 2019 style bear market, maybe it doesn't have to last a whole year. Perhaps it just lasts say 6 months or something, and maybe they replace Powell as the chair of the Federal Reserve in May, and then they ignite the animal spirits once again and run it hot, and then we go back into higher inflation and we try to get ourselves out of a weakening labor market. But yeah, I mean that's the reason why I compare it to 2019 is just because it feels very similar in terms of monetary policy, and the bull run that we just had by Bitcoin felt very similar to the 2019 bull run, where there was also no alt season in 2019. Like when Bitcoin topped in June, there was no alt season after that top. Um, so I think those are like there's a lot of reasons why. Also, one more reason is I don't know. I mean, I don't know if this is exactly true. I think you can find some nuances to this statement, but you and now the Fed funds rate is closer to the 2 year yield, which I kind of approximate as the neutral rate. Um, there hasn't really been a durable, sustained alt season recently where the Fed funds rate was well above the 2 year yield, right? So now that the Fed funds rate is getting closer to the 2 year yield, it becomes a possibility, but unfortunately, it's also kind of lining up when we normally have a bear market. So it might take a little bit. It might take a little bit more time to get to where people want to go. Remember the way for Bitcoin, I think the way for Bitcoin to truly go a lot higher is to have is to have looser and looser monetary policy. But the problem, as you said it earlier, the stock market is essentially at all-time highs. Like the Fed's not going to come save our altcoins. If the stock market were to start dropping a lot, then the Fed would start printing. But by the way, in 2019, Bitcoin started underperforming the S&P 500 as well, right? So if you look at like the Bitcoin valuation against the S&P, it was dropping like a rock, and it continued to drop, and it only recovered after the S&P dropped in the COVID crash, right? And then that led to all the money printing. So we're kind of in that phase where for Bitcoin to really get a powerful move higher to new all-time highs and whatnot, you almost could argue that we need to see a sell-off in stocks first to then justify the looser monetary policy.